water is pretty important. So we need to talk about the effects of water and review some things. So hypotonic, hypertonic, these are things you should have learned. If a cell is in a hypotonic environment, what does that mean versus a hypertonic? And so I drew some pictures on my board. Hypotonic means that there are more solutes inside of a cell than outside of a cell. So the environment is hypotonic to the cell, more solutes inside than outside. Water is something that can easily pass through membranes. So when there's more solutes inside, what ends up happening is the water ends up rushing inside of the cell to bind to the solutes, and that's just what happens. So in a eukaryotic cell, in a hypotonic, it's going to get bigger, hippo, some of you remember it that way. The cell is going to enlarge because all that water is rushing in. In a eukaryotic cell, it's going to burst to life. In a prokaryotic cell, remember we've got the cell wall. So there's some protection. Remember my ball and the balloon, and I want to blow the balloon up, that water. So there is some protection. So we've got the prokaryotes, the bacteria have a little bit more protection against osmotic forces than a eukaryotic cell with just its cell membrane. So that's good, especially because they're out in the environment. In a hypertonic environment, the opposite happens. More solutes outside. Maybe this is fish, and you're salting the fish, and you use a lot of salt on the fish to help preserve it. You're preserving it because all the water is now rushing outside of the cell. Microorganisms need that water to grow, and you're taking it away, and so salting foods is a method of preserving it. Salting fish, salting meats. So the water is rushing out. So some vocabulary terms you need to know in regards to prokaryotes of that. When the cell membrane in a hypotonic environment is pushing against the cell wall, that is defined as turgor pressure. So that's a vocabulary term. When the cell membrane is shrinking because the water is being removed, so it's shrinking away from the cell wall, this is called crenation. And this is going to come up when we start talking about staining and capsule stainings, and you can see how that's affected. So again, learn those vocabulary terms for that. Okay, so let me see if I got it all. Turgor pressure in a hypotonic solution, the pressure against the cell membrane because the water is rushing in, no lysis due to the cell wall. Crenation, the cell membrane shrinks away from that due to fluid loss. And we talked about how salting preservation methods can be dependent on this osmotic pressure. And we'll talk about that in another chapter as well.